Good afternoon. With Election Day scheduled for next Monday, June 26th, thank you all for joining us today for what promises to be a very fulsome discussion of the Toronto mayoralty by-election. My name is Melissa Bruno. I am a principal here at Earnscliffe Strategies in Toronto. And before we begin, I want to introduce our panelists for today, starting with my Earnscliffe colleagues. Melanie Riche is a senior communications and digital consultant at Earnscliffe Strategies. With 8 years of experience in federal and provincial politics, Melanie has also worked as the Director of Communications and Media for federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, and knows and talks to many of the Toronto New Democrats, and has currently been talking to them about the mayoralty campaign. Nico Vavasis is a senior government affairs consultant in our Toronto office who has worked as a senior advisor to 2 cabinet ministers in the current provincial government, most recently serving as the director of policy to Ontario's Attorney General, and he is an active conservative who keeps in close touch with many of his colleagues currently working on various mayoralty campaigns. We are also joined by 2 very special guests. Karen Stintz is the president and CEO of Variety Children's Charity of Ontario and a former Toronto City Councillor and chair of the TTC. Karen was a city councillor from 2003 to 2014 and represented Ward 16, Eglinton Lawrence. And Josh Colle is a senior VP at EY and served as a Toronto City Councillor from 2010 to 2018. Josh is also a former TTC chair and served as chair of the Toronto Music Advisory Council and as a director for Toronto Hydro. I should mention that you are all able to submit questions at any time during the webinar by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be doing our best to answer as many questions as we can. So let's get started. My first question is for you, Karen. Now, you wrote something very interesting recently that I would like to quote, and it goes like this. There was a time when government existed to make life more livable. The mayoralty candidate who understands this and can articulate a way forward has a chance of wearing the mayor's chains on election day. Now, to what extent do you think this notion has impacted on the race so far?
Well, I think that there is a sense, in my discussions, and my feelings and how when I wrote that in the context of it was around the Eglinton Crosstown and the fact that there's this huge construction project underway and the government seems unable or unwilling to say when it's going to be completed, and yet there has been mass disruption along Eglinton for shopkeepers, for residents of the city, for those driving through town. And it appears again and again and again, whether you're driving downtown, you're into construction, uncoordinated, whether you're trying to get on the TTC, whether it's streetcars or buses that are being rerouted or short-turned, it's starting to feel like the city's working against the residents who live there and the communities that make the city that it is. And so that was a theme that I've identified. And I think people speak around it, but I'm not sure it's actually emerged as, the ballot question is the mayor going to be the person who's going to actually right the wrongs of the city and start taking care of those who live here in a way that is making their lives a little bit easier instead of a little bit more frustrating, which is how it's been increasingly feeling.
Yeah. Now, Karen, you also served under a rather tumultuous mayoralty of the late Rob Ford from 2010 to 2014. What was that like, and how might those years have cast maybe a bit of a shadow on the current race?
Yeah, well, they were interesting years. And, but again, what was interesting about when Rob Ford got elected is that, he was clearly elected as the guy who was going to stop the gravy train, as it were. He was the guy who was going to make City Hall accountable notionally. That's why people cast their ballot for Rob Ford. And again, those I think matter to people. Those ideas continue to matter to people, that City Hall is accountable, that City Hall spends money wisely, that they're focused, they've got their eye on the job and their eye on the ball rather. But then of course, because of all the noise and the controversy, when he left office, John Tory was elected. And, I think John Tory was elected because he was not Rob Ford. And there was this sense that he would continue to bring that same level of accountability and fiscal discipline to the city. And, in fact, I don't think that the last, and John Tory has been, termed a conservative mayor for the city of Toronto. In fact, I don't actually think he was a conservative mayor. And I think what we're seeing now is that the direction that he was taking the city is maybe not the direction that everybody is satisfied with. And so how it unfolds now is, the candidate that gets elected, is that going to be someone who is, just like John Tory was so unlike Rob Ford, is this next candidate going to be someone who's very unlike John Tory?
Josh, you served under both Mayor Rob Ford and Mayor John Tory. And I want to ask you about your time under Mayor Tory and how his time as mayor might have influenced this by-election, both in terms of style and tone, but also the expectation of voters.
Yeah, definitely two very different styles. And to Karen's point, John very much brought that kind of peace, order, and good government that at that time, I think everyone wanted. I think that it's an interesting dynamic. For the term I served with Tory, he was energetic. Certainly his kind of work ethic, it was well known, and he was in front of cameras all the time, right? So for 4 years, and then the pandemic hits, and that's amplified like crazy, right? So it's City Hall's being managed almost like a premier's office or a prime minister's office, and for the last 4 years, we've really only seen on our kind of TV screens and our elevators and dental offices John Tory, right? It's been, especially as the spokesperson through the pandemic, and so. One of the things that, because he has run such like a tight communication ship and he was out there so much, I think in some ways, obviously his kind of personal brand is huge and omnipresent, but councillors under him, especially for the last 4 years, really weren't able to develop much of a profile. And I think you're seeing that a bit in some of the kind of current councillors who are seeking the job. They didn't have the platform that others might have had under previous mayors, where there was a little more leeway for kind of other voices and faces to get some of that airtime. So I think that for sure has influenced the race. And obviously, the elephant or gorilla in the room, I don't know the metaphor, but obviously it's his departure too. And just the suddenness of it means that it's a really compressed race, and we can't underscore how that impacts people's ability to get their name out there, right? It's some of these mayoralty campaigns, and I don't like it, but they've been getting to the point where they're like for a year. When it's compressed, all of a sudden, it's really hard to get your name out there in a really short window. And so I think the suddenness of it too has a real impact on kind of the tone and type of election we're experiencing now.
Josh, I also want to ask you this, and Karen, you might have thoughts on this as well. How do you run a campaign that's aimed at 3 million potential voters over several, far-reaching neighborhoods across Toronto with minimal campaign infrastructure, but also minimal resources?
And Karen knows this better than I, so I'll speak quickly and then defer to her, but it's an enormous task, right? It takes a ton of money. And so and volunteers and resources. And so the one thing we know immediately is it excludes a lot of people really from running a credible race when you have to raise, million or millions of dollars to do that. But at the same time, I'm still a believer in some of the kind of really traditional campaign tactics. And so there's a candidate I won't name, but we kind of all laugh at him, kind of having his billboards out there. But, sometimes when it's a really crowded field and in a short race, kind of have to just get that name out there any way you can. If that means the billboard or bus shelter, do that too, but it takes a ton of money, time, and energy and volunteers. But Karen would know better than I.
Right. Well, yeah. So it is what the disconnect we're seeing a little bit is that in order to be on the ballot, it only costs an individual $200, right? So for $200, you can notionally run for mayor, but to actually have a campaign, you need to raise, upwards of 2 million, and 2 million sounds like a lot of money, but it actually doesn't get you much. And so when you're thinking about, how you get your name across an entire city, federal governments, provincial governments, they have riding associations. So they have the built-in infrastructure to actually be able to run mini campaigns across their designated areas. The mayor has none of that. And so they have to build it. And to Josh's point, this was a bit of a surprise campaign. So anybody who was thinking about running for mayor at the next go round would have been putting this infrastructure in place, right, for the next scheduled election, not for this summer. And so it really was a Herculean task to run for mayor on this by-election. And it's not surprising, given that it was only a $200 entry fee, that we have so many people on the ballot, and that it is as noisy as it is, because again, to Josh's point, nobody had the chance except Olivia to build that type of brand and name recognition to have them be distinguishable from everybody else.
Yeah. Melanie, as has been noted, there's more than 100 candidates on the ballot in this race. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of having so many candidates in the race? And do you think that the debates have had any measurable influence on voter intention?
So to Josh and Karen's point, because it is so competitive, it's really hard for folks who didn't already have the name recognition to get out there and to use this shorter campaign to do that. What my experience with too many folks kind of in the same, talking to the same kind of people has done is that often when there's too many candidates, either like for this example, we have a lot of candidates in the center and we have a lot of candidates in the right. And what that has done is nobody has really edged themselves forward as the top contender who is speaking to that pool of voters. And what we saw in the last provincial election with Doug Ford, kind of with Andrea and Del Duca, while it was only two of them, none of them were ever able to say, I am better than the other candidate and here's why, and then edge ahead and have an opportunity to really be a challenge to Doug Ford in the last election. And I think we're seeing this play out as well with this large field of candidates, is you've got a lot of people talking to the same group of voters and none of them have been able to edge forward. So I think that has been a big impact on this mayoral campaign. And as it relates to debates, we kind of see the same thing. We see this often in the States where there's a large field of folks on stage debating, and it usually makes for, how can I say this? It makes for less efficient debates, maybe is a way to say it. It's harder to hear through the noise when you have all those people talking or all those people talking at each other, to have a good perspective of, okay, this is the candidate that speaks to my values, that's going to make a difference, that I want to, check my, I'm going to vote for this person. So I think that has been one of the biggest impacts on the race, is that there's just so many people who put their name forward.
I've heard many commentators refer to this campaign as being incredibly boring. Nico, would you agree with that assessment? And are you at all surprised by what seems to be how little interest there's been from a voter perspective in this race? And maybe more importantly, do you think it's likely to change as we head into the final weekend of this campaign?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the character of this campaign in comparison to others, big issues at stake, a lot of conversation about Toronto, being in a state of decline, a ton of different policies and visions for the city, available for voters to consume. There's no incumbent. Those are the ingredients of a race that's very exciting traditionally. But I think in a vacuum that's true. But I think there's a difference between a race that's exciting and one that everyone's paying attention to and that voters are engaged in. So boring, I would say no, not boring, but definitely a lack of interest from the electorate so far. The final vote tallies will bear that out in the end. But I think for those same reasons why folks like us find it so captivating and interesting. It makes it challenging for voters, who are busy living their lives and going into summer to pay attention and plug into this campaign. As others have mentioned, 100+ candidates. There's really an information overload right now. So somebody who might traditionally clue into a campaign like this and rally behind a particular candidate is having the difficulty sifting through all of that and finding somebody to identify with and follow closely and measure against other similar candidates. I'll give an example. My neighbor's got 4 lawn signs out on their front yard. There's 2 Fury, 1 Saunders, and Olivia Chow. So I'm not quite certain what to make of that, but I think it's emblematic.
Probably not voting.
Probably
Yeah, maybe
not
not
voting.
voting. But
And that's the point, right? And this is also an election, an electorate who does have some degree of election fatigue. 7 in the last 5 years when you consider all orders of government. Those sorts of things, make it challenging for somebody to be interested, but perhaps they are excited by it.
Yeah, and I would say for those of us on this panel that were relatively tuned in, we see very distinct differences between the candidates. But for the general public who's not maybe as paying as close attention, the reality is they all are saying very similar things, and they all sound very similar in terms of addressing homelessness, safe communities, wraparound supports, supporting transit. And no one is actually broken through the noise. And no one's created, to be honest with you, really any controversy that would have anybody start paying attention to what anybody's saying. And because it all sounds the same, they're like, oh, I don't know, it's boring. I don't know who to vote for. I don't know who they are. And so that's not like that's the overwhelming challenge that this election is all about.
Yeah, and to return to the second question, is that likely to change in the final week of the campaign? I think, given what we've seen so far, you would need some sort of externality to really change the way that people are paying attention to this race, whether that's an event that, puts the focus sharply on public safety and all of a sudden Mark Saunders, has the podium and is the candidate that everybody's paying attention to. As far as an endorsement, I think breaking news, John Tory has said he's going to be endorsing Anna Bilau. Too little, too late, I think personally, but we will see.
Karen, I want to come back to you for a second, and just in noting, some of the incredible work that you've done on behalf of children's charities across Ontario. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts around the growing gap between the rich and the poor, specifically the working poor, and how do you think economic issues are playing into this campaign?
Yeah, so those are sort of, from my view, 2 very different questions. And, from a city perspective, I do worry about the growing disparity between those who have a livable income and those who do not. And what does it mean when we don't have a stable middle class? And what does it mean when we have families that are choosing to leave the city because they can't afford to buy a house, and a house is still a dream that they harbor? And so if they want to be pursuing that, it has to be somewhere out of the city. I think those are very concerning things for a city, and we need to take them seriously, because the consequence is that we end up being a city like San Francisco, where you have a high concentration of those with money and then a very high concentration with those that don't. And that's not what I would define as a livable city. So I think it is an issue. I think where it doesn't translate into a mayoral race is the limited ability of any mayor to actually fix the systemic issues that are creating the wealth inequity. And although everyone's talking a good game about increasing housing and increasing affordability and improving livability, there's actually very little that a mayor can do, and very little that a council can do, to be quite honest. You can tinker around the edges, but you can't, unless the city decides to build more housing itself, which I think would be a disaster. There's really little that anyone can do except make a pledge to care about it. And I think the public actually gets that too. And so, yes, I think it is a concern that is emerging. I think what's being left with the public is, I see this as a problem. We see addiction and mental health as an issue. I don't actually think any of the mayors can do anything about it, but I think something needs to be done. And that's where the general consensus is right now.
Josh, in 2019, the average number of individual boardings on the TTC totaled more than 3 million per day. Now, those numbers are down significantly since the pandemic, which obviously presents some very real challenges. As a former TTC chair, how do you think transit is playing as an issue for people who rely on the TTC?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly to start the campaign, it was the public safety on transit, right? That was the issue, and you could see the framing of it with a lot of the candidates right out of the gate. And then the weather got warmer, and some of the kind of behavior that was being witnessed on the TTC, I think, started to shift out, and probably is happening now in other spaces and places in the city, unfortunately. So certainly that has been, it really shaped the early days of the campaign. And I think that's still on many people's minds. And part of the reason why, one of the many reasons ridership is still down post-pandemic. But I think more than anything, people who use transit regularly, and I'm one of those people, I think there is a bit of a cynicism around promises of new lines and new maps and that kind of transit conversation. More than anything, I think transit users, and really for people that have left transit or maybe have never used it and want to come back, they want to just see reliable, kind of obviously safe and frequent transit. And so I think there's an opportunity both for a campaign platform, but also as an incoming mayor with a bit of a back to basics kind of message and approach and delivering on that. Because you know what? The Ontario line, the mayor of Toronto cannot control what that project looks like, and it could be another crosstown or it could be great. But what they can control is the frequency and reliability of service, the cleanliness and safety of buses, streetcars, and subways that are out there, and how you prioritize the road to see if you can get transit moving more frequently. And that can mean a lot of different things. And I'm sure there are lots of debates on, how we share the road. We'd love to talk about that in Toronto. But clearly that is something within a mayor's control and a council's control. And I think that needs to be the focus. And I think that would resonate with people who have either left transit or are regular riders.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
sorry, Karen, go ahead.
No, and I think just to underscore that, if there's anything that is within the mayor's control, it is around transit. And we've just learned that the TTC has budgeted for people to come back to the office 3 days a week. And because the TTC budget relies so much on fare revenue, that ridership number, it becomes even more important for a transit agency like Toronto than even anywhere else in North America. And so now we see that they're not actually coming back 3 days a week, they're coming back 2 days a week. And so to Josh's point, we're not only, it's supporting the transit riders that exist today, but it's also encouraging people who have left that it's okay to come back because they've left for very real reasons. And they are making choices because they can. And all of that is very detrimental to the ongoing sustainability and viability of the system. And so, I like Josh mentioned at the beginning of the campaign, TTC was very much a focus. Now it's shifted and it's not even coming up as an issue. And I think it is one of those sleeper issues because it's not just about getting people around the city. It's about the economic vitality of the core. And it's about, the sustainability of the system overall.
Karen, I'm going to stick with you for a sec. And, also noting that you're a former TTC chair. Earlier, you'd mentioned the Eglinton Crosstown project.
They're everywhere, these former chairs.
I know, right?
So you had mentioned the Eglinton Crosstown project, and I want to ask you about that, but also the role Metrolinx plays in that and the potential impact on voting attention in this by-election.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, at the time that Metrolinx was created, I was actually very enthusiastic about what the role it could play for capital expansion for transit across the region, because we had taken a very parochial approach to building transit when really our commuting patterns are not just within the city, our commuting patterns are within the region. So to have a provincial organization that was charged with figuring out the right investment for a growing region, I thought was actually a big step forward. Obviously best intentions translate differently. And now we have the crosstown. And I think, I'm to give Metrolinx the benefit of the doubt that maybe they've learned a lot through this exercise around, how transit and capital projects should and could be built. Nonetheless, it has created unbelievable upset. And the one thing that I think the agency is still not understanding is that its inability to commit to when it's going to open, undermines its legitimacy and its credibility. And so it's launching on the Ontario line without actually delivering on the Eglinton Crosstown. And there's a lot of legitimate questions about, can this agency actually deliver? And they're ignoring all of that. And I think in that process, undermining their credibility. Whether I don't think it translates actually to this mayoral election, because I think rightly or wrongly, Metrolinx is seen as very much a provincial agency, very much a government agency, and very much under the direction of the provincial government. And so although the city officials and some city councillors have made it part of their platform to, make changes at Metrolinx or hold them to account, the reality is it's not going to happen either. And I don't think anybody thinks that John Tory or city council is responsible for Metrolinx.
Melanie, I'm going to come to you. It's been noted that housing has sort of surfaced as an important issue in this campaign, both in terms of how hard home ownership has become and the rising cost of rent, noting that nearly half of Torontonians rent in this city. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of housing as a policy issue?
So usually, or in the past, I think what we've seen folks talk about affordable housing, and we've seen folks talk about helping you buy a home, where there's kind of a missing thing there, and it's like a home that you can afford, right? Which isn't necessarily affordable housing, but it's helping people actually find somewhere to live that is safe, that's affordable, whatever. And what we're seeing is more and more you're having to talk to those folks in the middle, because folks who make good salaries are renting and they're not actually able to buy. Or when you talk about affordable housing, they turn off. Well, that's not me. I don't need that. I'm doing well. I just can't afford a place to buy. So typically, or in the past, I think the old adage or whatever was that renters don't vote, whereas I don't think that that's true at all now, right? You've got this you've got the group in the middle that actually is very involved and paying attention to a lot of what's happening, but they're not able to buy, or they would love to buy, but that's just not a possibility in Toronto. So the focus on homes that are affordable, or the focus on policies that would actually help renters or would help protect renters with the increase of rent, I think has been super important for this election. And not only will be important in what comes after the election, but I think we're seeing this in policy across the country and across the province too, where folks are trying to figure out, how do we talk to these folks in the middle, because the demographics of what that looks like is very different, and those folks are actually super engaged and are paying close attention to what the candidates are saying.
Nico, there are likely lots of issues in this campaign that are not necessarily getting the attention that they deserve. When it comes to voter intentions, how important do you think services are like waste collection or municipal waiting pools to voters?
Yeah, I think, any one of those services individually, probably a near zero impact on voting intention. Is there a single issue voter who's looking specifically at waiting pool policy? Probably not. But what I would say though is that, these services tend to get wrapped up into larger issues, larger perspectives on what they want, what voters want out of a mayor. What I mean by that is, service delivery can be viewed as, a municipal government competency issue. It can be viewed under, financial sustainability and restraint. It can be viewed as a public safety issue. So I think when voters who do have, very real concerns about, city services such as these, they're looking for whether these positions match up against, a candidate's broader view and broader priority set. So if you're, somebody who sees City Hall as being broken, it's not focused on the services that you rely on, it's wasting time and money, you're going to be looking to hear from a candidate that sees the city the same way and reflects that view. So, I think one good example of this, as for a voter who, sees too much bureaucracy in government and that is affecting their ability to effectively deliver services. Something like Anthony Fury speaking about, cafe TO applications and bringing in an automatic approval after 6 months. So, I think broadly it's not about any one issue, but how each of these individual issues collectively pile up to the vision that any one candidate is bringing forward.
I want to ask each of you what you see as being maybe a potential sleeper issue of the campaign, and what could be motivating voters in ways that we don't necessarily see. For example, is crime a bigger issue than maybe we realize? And maybe we'll start with Josh, then going to Karen, Nico, and Melanie.
Yeah, it's a good question, Melissa. And I think, kind of your conversation with Nico does touch on some of those, so I think where there's great commonality between someone, say, on the right or the left, is that they want services at a certain, standard. And so we talk about a lot of washrooms in parks, right? The washroom that is not open or broken in a park, on one side of the aisle, someone sees as like, you should invest more in it. The other side of the aisle, they see it's a sign of waste and ineffectiveness or inefficiency at City Hall. But at the end of the day, they still want services delivered. So I think there is an element that for most people out there, because, we all know this, like if any of us have knocked on doors, local issues is what on people's minds. So they are thinking about waste collection, and they're thinking about pools and parks and all those things. And so their view of the city and City Hall is dramatically shaped by how they see those services delivered and how they impact them personally and their families and in their neighborhood. So I think that those issues are a real driver, and there is a current out there where people think that whatever your political bent is, or what do you think the fix is, that there's services aren't being delivered, the basics aren't being delivered like they should be. And so that influences, I think, a lot of people's voter intent and just general kind of view of how government is working for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that sentiment, and that there is a sense. I don't think there's a sleeper issue. I think there's a growing consensus that if there's a ballot question, I think it's really, okay, who's going to beat Olivia Chow? Because to your point, Josh, if the pervasive view is that you fix these issues by pouring more money at it, there's a sense of people's belief that Olivia will pour more money at it. If you believe that those are systematic of a broken system, then the last thing you want to do is pour money in a broken system. And so it's emerging as, Olivia will be the defender of the investing into the system and potentially keeping it broken, or who else is going to stop this? And the thing that's concerning to me as a resident of the city is the increasing conversations I'm hearing about people who just don't enjoy living in the city anymore. And whether it's because they can't get the service, that they see evidence of decline, that they can't get in their cars, they don't have a bike, TTC is not an option. Like they just, everything is that much harder. Everything is that much more crowded. Everything is that much more irritating. And this pervasive sense is that, this isn't the city that I actually want to stay in anymore. And I think, Brad Bradford tried to capture that with his motto, you don't have to move to Hamilton. Like we can make Toronto that place again. But I think that it hasn't broken out as a message that's resonating with people. But I think if anything, that's a sleeper issue, is that nobody can exactly tell you why that they don't necessarily enjoy living in the city as much anymore. But there is that pervasive feeling that it's just become harder and harder and harder. And there is no one out there who understands that it's just when you start to not like where you live and the community that you're in, then you start making decisions around leaving it. And that would be very, very bad for our city.
Yeah, and I'll take this question maybe in a slightly different direction. An issue that's not necessarily a sleeper, because I don't think it's front of mind for much of the electorate, but one that's ultimately going to matter a lot when we do have a new mayor, and that's the fiscal sustainability of the city. We're facing a massive deficit, and that's not being matched by satisfaction with the investments that the city is making. So when you look at Olivia Chow, for example, there's a lot. This has been a widely discussed issue. A lot of discussion around what her taxation plan looks like, particularly around property taxes. So perhaps not a sleeper issue in the campaign itself, but a sleeper issue moving forward. How is the city going to get back to balance in future? What does that look like? What are the interjurisdictional consequences of that? How does this get negotiated with the provincial and federal government? Not necessarily something that's been front of mind for voters or most of voters right now, but for the new mayor, that will likely be priority number one.
I'll go back to what Josh was saying, because to me that's the most important thing as well, is folks before folks cast their ballot. I think for the most part, whether their number one issue is transit, whether their number one issue is finding somewhere to live or fixing the pothole in front of their driveway that drives them nuts, I think the thing that people are looking for is somebody who hears them and somebody who then does something about it. And that is true for every issue, whether it's the issue that we've been talking about this whole time, or whether it's the wading pool down the street or whatnot. So I think as we are going to Monday, and as we're really seeing folks talk to the people that they need to move to vote for them in the next few days, I think that's really going, or should be at least, the focus is making sure that the folks that you want to vote for you feel like they're being heard and feel like you can actually do something about it or start to do something about it. So not necessarily a sleeper issue, but on all of these issues, I think what folks are really just looking for is to be heard, to be understood. I'm frustrated, I'm upset, this isn't working. Okay, I hear that, and I'm going to do something about it. So I think that'll be the challenge in the next few days. We don't have very many days left, but heading into Monday, that'll really be important for every candidate, regardless of where they stand, to really be connecting with folks on that level and making sure that they're heard and feel like they're going to be voting for somebody at City Hall who's going to try to do something about it.
And just Melanie, to that point, that's largely what Rob Ford's appeal was. Mm-hmm. It's not even a left-right thing. Like, I remember the time mm-hmm. knocking on doors, and people who were like card-carrying NDP members or members of unions were proudly telling me they were going to vote for him. Whether his promises were kept or realistic or not, they kind of felt like he gets what my pain is, and I kind of understand that you're going to try and do something about it, right? And so I think that can be owned by people on different sides of the political spectrum, and that does influence where you kind of check a box beside someone's name.
And I think it's a challenge that candidates often have, because you want to talk about policy, you want to talk about all the things that you will do, but it's actually more important to just connect with folks. So successful in doing that will be.
But also, Rob Ford, for all of what he brought to the table, he certainly wasn't afraid of stirring controversy and taking a position and defending that position. And I think, if anything, this campaign might be labeled boring, because the reality is nobody's really taken any controversial position on anything. They've all been talking about the same things, by and large. And so I think that if there's anything that maybe people wanted to see out of this election, because, John was very conciliatory, right? He was the guy who would always search for the resolution that everybody could buy into. But, over time that begins to wear, because you can't make everybody happy all the time. And there's a sense that, we've all had to sacrifice to make sure everybody's happy. Well, wait a minute, I'm actually not happy, right? Like, I can't get around town. I can't get things done. I can't, I don't know who to call to get this fixed. I don't even think anybody cares if it's broken. And so that there's that sort of, maybe whether this election wasn't able to articulate it, but the next election for sure will. That just the clear articulation of, okay, to your point that was raised, is anybody listening to what actually needs to get done here? And is anybody willing to do anything about it, even if it means making some hard choices?
In the spirit of connecting with people, I have been reviewing the Q&A, and it looks like there are some questions in there. And in our tradition here at Earnscliffe, it is to have the panelist, who is the most recent addition to our team, field the questions from the viewers, and that happens to be Melanie Riche. Melanie, what do we have?
Thanks, Melissa. So we have this question from Derek. I think that is pretty timely. So he says, Ford backs Saunders, Tory backs Ballot. Does anyone care? And could these endorsements even do more harm than good at this point?
Josh, what do you think?
So I question the value of endorsements. I know they're really great for a campaign team. Like, it really feels good, and it gives you kind of some energy and wind in your sails. I do, though, think right now, for part of the reason we've discussed, where it's been difficult to get names out there. Lots of people are searching and lurching for who do I vote for? I've never been asked that more in an election in my life. I would say those are two endorsements that may have a bit of an influence, because people will associate it, bad or good, with almost like a proxy for, if I like fill in the blank, then maybe I'm okay with this person, because they know so little about the leading contenders and their profile has been relatively low. I think those two can have an influence. I don't know if the timing works or not, because these seem to come with less than a week to go. So I'd say on the whole, I'm very skeptical of endorsements. I do think these two in this type of race could move the needle.
Maybe I'll hop in here to Josh's point. I think endorsements, outside of making folks feel good internally, the campaign team, I think they serve two purposes. If you lack credibility, or if you lack name recognition, right? Like, those are the two purposes for regular folks. So in the now this may not actually totally work, because Ford and Tory are backing different people, but in the who emerges from the center or the right to possibly challenge Olivia in a more real way as we see the polls. I think this is helpful, because then people can say, okay, here is where I'm going to put my vote, now that there is a clear or a better understanding of who can be that candidate. But for the flip side, I would say if I was on Olivia's campaign team, I would use this as, here's more of the status quo. We know you've been pointing to these folks as being the status quo, as not being the change that you are all saying that you're looking for. Here's proof of that. So I think it also, on the flip side, helps that campaign team with the message that they've been pushing throughout the campaign.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Oh, sorry, Nico.
If I could add a third purpose, perhaps, to an endorsement, it's also about the signal that it sends, to those who are engaged in politics and are aligned with the person doing the endorsing, to get out and provide that physical labor and support, particularly in this last week of the election, where all efforts are going to be in getting out the vote. Do I think a lawn sign on the Premier's front lawn is a strong enough signal for those who support him to go out and do that work? Probably not. You might need something a little bit more forceful than that. But there is a possibility that those who support the Premier, especially those who are in his closer orbit, might go out and lend a hand, and that's always helpful.
Yeah, and I guess I would take a bit of a different view on it, in that while John Tory's personal popularity remains quite high as an individual, I don't think that translates into the general sense of what he did as mayor. And I think that there is a relative disappointment where the city's at right now. Like, if the city was thriving and everybody was great and we were really feeling good about things, then a John Tory endorsement might be very, very valuable. But at the 11th hour, after the Star endorses Anna, it just seems like, oh, more John Tory. And if I were Anna, I'm not actually even sure I would want that endorsement, to be honest, because if she wants to differentiate herself from the path that Tory was carving for the city, then then that's not going to happen now, because Tory is basically saying that Anna will continue what he has started. And also with Ford, I think Ford remains extremely popular across the province, but I think we can all agree that what he's done to the city is quite terrible. It's quite tragic. Like he merged the wards. He, cut off some funding that was very needed in order to build infrastructure. He's treated it like a little fiefdom. And I think if you're paying attention, you think, well, I don't know that I necessarily want, I don't mind Ford provincially doing what he's doing. I don't know that I want Ford's guy at City Hall, because that might just be too much. So it will be very interesting to see what happens. And I'm not actually as confident that these campaigns are going to get the bump that they think they're going to get from these endorsements.
On the thread of popularity, Melanie, almost all of the public opinion polls seem to be telling us that Olivia Chow is positioned to win. What can you tell us about Olivia, and what kind of mayor do you think she'll be?
Well, all of my experience with Olivia is that she is somebody that you can always call on for help, but more than that, you rarely have to call on her for help, because she's offering it anyways before you get to help. I think if you are somebody who's hoping to work with Olivia, it'll be important to either get a coalition of people to back your cause, or to get really buy-in from the people in Toronto, because I think she is super closely connected to the realities of folks who are maybe having a harder time getting by than folks who are maybe doing okay. What my experience with Olivia is she's somebody that brings people together. In French, we would say rassembleur, so somebody, which is so much nicer in French than there is no real English word to compare to, but somebody who can have a different opinion than you and really bring people around at the table and have those different opinions and get stuff done. She was able to do it as councillor, but also federally and provincially as well. So I think there's a lot of experience there to Karen's point earlier, that there's not a lot of stuff that people are faced with are not actually municipal things that the next mayor can take a shot at fixing, but the ability to have those conversations with somebody that you disagree with in Ottawa, or somebody that you disagree with at the legislature will be super important. And I think Olivia embodies that with class. So I think that as next mayor, I would look forward to her doing that and doing that more successfully than I think people give her credit for, because she's the NDP person. I don't think that we're going to see that play out in a way where, I'm not having conversations with people who disagree with me. So that's what I would tell folks, that what they can expect from Olivia's mayor.
If we go over to the other side of the political spectrum, Nico, two candidates that are perceived to be on the right, Mark Saunders and Anthony Furey. Do you think that the two of them will end up splitting the vote on the right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's also true, for many of the other front runner candidates, right? Saunders and Furey, absolutely. Bilo and Bradford, Matlow and Chow, pick your dance partner. I think ultimately, that is going to prove to be a limited factor in the outcome of this race, given where we are and where the polls sit right now. You put Furey and Saunders' numbers together, and you're not even really all that close to Olivia Chow still. But what I'm looking for really is, amongst any of the pairs of folks that are cannibalizing one another, are they able to separate themselves well enough between each other and amongst all of the other candidates to finish in second place? It's a very challenging time for this city right now, both fiscally and the management of the city at City Hall, but also for those of us who live here. So, you could potentially be looking at a situation where Olivia Chow becomes the mayor and is the one to hold the bag for all of these challenging times. And then, the individual that finishes in second place becomes the de facto mayor in waiting, and they use their good positioning in this election to springboard them in the next mayoral race.
Josh and Karen, both on council, and I think when you were on council, you were part of a informal group of council members known as the Mighty Middle. Is there still a chance that a candidate can go up the middle and capture a meaningful portion of folks who voted for maybe John Tory in 2014 and 2018?
Maybe I'll start. So in this election, there 100% was. I'm not sure if there still is, just because of the waning days. I think there was, but my reflection, and we touched on this a lot, like, so it's about, people's experience living in the city. We're also in this weird post-policy pandemic world. I actually don't think I've never heard policy have less of a focus in an election, maybe in my life. And you're starting to see that trend, right? So it's not just a city thing. The last provincial government was elected with a massive majority with no platform. And that's becoming the trend. And I think part of that is a reflection of people are tired. People want to focus on like getting their kid to hockey or going on vacation or just not thinking about these things. And so in that context, I actually think there's a path for anyone in a campaign like this. But then so much of it becomes name recognition. So how do you kind of stick out? Is it a stunt? Is it a controversial policy like, Karen suggested? Like, think about David Miller, right? The Island Airport Bridge. No one in the city knew that they cared about a bridge to the airport, but all of a sudden they're like, oh, that's the guy who's going to stop the bridge. So he was able to distinguish himself. Or if it's just outspending everyone and getting your name out there, I feel like this election was not a policy one and a name recognition one. And so there was a path, and I just don't know if it's still there just because of timing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I think the path to victory, looking back is very tactical, and it wasn't about big policy pronouncements. I think you're absolutely right, Josh, because there's just not the capacity to really dissect that. And there's also not, I think, within the city, the belief that the mayor really has that much ability to do a lot of these big things that all of these candidates are talking about. But the one thing I would perhaps have a different lens on than Nico is that if Olivia Chow, in fact, is the mayor and gets elected as mayor, I think the one thing that the only person who's going to be left standing to challenge that mandate, as it were, is Brad Bradford, because he's the only one who's going to be on council. Anthony Fury is going to go away. Mark Saunders is going to do something else. Anna's going to go back to her job. The only one that will be left to articulate an alternative view is Brad Bradford, because Josh is the same as Olivia Chow. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out and whether or not Brad can get enough support to legitimately hold Olivia to account and to make sure that she doesn't feel like she has the quote mandate to use the strong mayor powers to do things that actually the city hasn't given her the mandate to do.
And to that point, it's a 3-year mandate, right? It is a shorter mandate than usual. So you're almost already starting to figure out what you're doing for the next one or how you're going to position yourself for the next one. So it's a very short runway to prove yourself as mayor. But if you're not mayor, prove yourself as somebody who can take them to task.
That's right.
Maybe Karen, just going to you on that sort of thread, how important will the new, I guess, in terms of what is at stake in this campaign, how important will the new mayor be to the future of the city? Also noting that it's a 3-year term, and of course, other people that haven't spoken yet might have views on this as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, let's make the assumption that it's Olivia, because all the polls would indicate that that's how it's going to conclude. I actually think that the next mayoral campaign will be much more a discussion about visions of the city, because I think Olivia will have had 3 years to lay out what her mandate is and what her vision is for the city. And then there will be a challenger that will emerge in opposition of that. And it won't be the same crowded field that we see. I think that there will be, 1 or 2 contenders that will come up and challenge Olivia in the next election. And I think the next election will be much more of a public engagement around where we want to go as a city.
And just maybe adding to that, I think it's no easy task that the incoming mayor is going to be kind of saddled with. And so on day one, you've got a over $1 billion operating hole to fix. You've got probably over $40 billion in a capital bill that's outstanding, right? Just basic repairs and maintenance in the city, and not a lot of indication that the feds or province are coming to step up and solve that issue. So I think the mayor has 2 choices, right? Whoever that's going to be, they can kind of punt on it and, get by with some, duct tape and chicken wire, or you can make tough decisions. And probably what that looks like doesn't get you reelected. Mm-hmm. Because I'm not sure what mayor is going to say, hey, guess what? We're going to raise taxes. We're going to introduce new revenue tools, but also we're going to cut services, sell some things, and probably get out of the business of a bunch of different programs and cancel capital projects. That's what the bill requires, right? That's outstanding right now. I'm not sure that anyone wants to do that who has a hope to then run and win in 26. So I think that will be the really interesting dilemma faced by whoever sits in that chair in a week or so.
Melanie, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Hey, let me take a quick look here. We talked about endorsements, we talked about polls. Maybe I'll go with, do we believe the polls? We had a pre-conversation on this before the panel. Maybe we go to that question.
Sure, I can kick it off. I mean, I think the basic consideration is that it would likely be a historic polling error if Olivia Chow were not to go ahead and actually hold the lead that the polls.
Which I feel like we've seen though. We've seen some of those recently, right?
By 20 points though, that seems a little.
I know.
Quite Rob Ford level comeback, but yeah, I mean, it would certainly be shocking, especially given the duration that she's held this lead for, and the variety of outlets who have reported. There's not a couple of outliers who have a secret sauce and are hearing something else. But what I would also say is, given her name recognition, if there is an error in the polling, perhaps it's really because voters are, as we said earlier, are still sifting through, the 100+ candidates, the various policy positions that they've seen brought forward, and are sitting in that don't know column. And there are a lot of people like that. So I think the question is more, how much does that undecided pool translate into decided and voting, or does that undecided pool remain undecided through election day and doesn't show up? And the strong ground game of Olivia Chow and the existing name recognition benefit that she has, does that carry her over the finish line?
Maybe I'll give a bit of a different take on that second half of what Nico said. As somebody who's had her heart broken 1 million times by polls, I look at not the top questions, I look at different questions that polling does, and what at least gives me an indication that it could be like that polls are, or what we're seeing in the polls are legitimate, is the question of, are you hopeful about this candidate? And I think this last poll that came out was, I think something like 51% of people asked were hopeful by Olivia Chow's prospects at becoming mayor. So that to me speaks to it perhaps holding. And then the other thing that I would say is the question of, are you happy with the direction of the city or not happy? And I think 64% of respondents said that they were not happy. So that to me would say, okay, well, which candidate has made it very clear that they want to take a different direction from what the direction that John Tory was taking the city in, and those kind of separate questions that we don't always take a deeper look at, I think tell me that this polling we may actually see come Monday night.
We are definitely at time, but Josh or Karen, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add there?
No, I'm just really curious to see the turnout number. That to me is the one that I'm most intrigued by. And this is terrible timing for an election. I know we couldn't control all of that, but I'm really curious to see what kind of mandate whoever wins gets. I think that will be really intriguing.
Yeah, and just a footnote, I've in my experience of elections, I've never seen a vote so fluid, so close to election day. So I'm not suggesting the polls are wrong, but I am suggesting that there is room for surprise.
Yeah, fair enough. And just as we've been talking throughout the hour, I think it has now been official that John Tory has endorsed Anna Bialau. But sadly, that's all the time we have for what has truly been a fascinating discussion. So a big thank you to our viewers for joining us today, and a special thank you to our panelists and our guests, Karen Stintz and Josh Colle. I am sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions we received, but we will try to follow up with you after the webinar. And we will be sharing a recording of today's video with all of you, which you are welcome to share with your friends and colleagues. I am Melissa Bruno of Earnscliffe Strategies, and thank you for watching. And for those of you joining us from Toronto, please remember to vote on Monday, June 26th.